Tickets. The words smacked of dismissal. Not a good morning, not even a flicker of human recognition. Just tickets. Sienna gripped her boarding pass, rage building. But Quincy? She just smiled. A small, almost sad smile that made my gut clench. It was the kind of smile you give someone right before you unleash hell, but not the fire and brimstone kind. Nah, this was ice water in the veins, slow burn. I saw the way her eyes narrowed, a calculation flickering behind the dark pupils. They think they're dealing with another pair of scared teenagers. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Not a clue. The other passengers waiting in line exchanged knowing glances and smirks. Another case of entitled teenagers trying to game the system, thinking they could talk their way into seats they clearly couldn't afford. But then something extraordinary happened. The uncertainty in Quincy's voice disappeared. Her shoulders straightened. When she lifted her phone and looked directly at Kyle Manning, there was something burning in her dark eyes that made his condescending smile freeze on his face. "We're calling our father," she said, her voice no longer pleading. It was calm, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. Dead silence fell over gate 32. Kyle's fingers stopped mid-type. The smirking passengers suddenly looked uncomfortable because everyone just realized they had treated exactly the wrong family with such prejudice. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with its usual controlled chaos on this crisp Tuesday morning in October. Flight 847 to LaGuardia was scheduled to depart in 2 hours, giving the identical twins plenty of time to navigate what should have been a routine check-in process. Quincy and Sienna Beaumont had been planning this college tour trip for months. At 17, they were among Wellington Preparatory Academy's most promising students. Quincy with her 4 SOCA GPA and early admission to Columbia's pre-law program, Sienna with her perfect SAT scores and scholarship offers from NYU's business school. Their father, Victor Sinclair, had finally agreed to let them travel alone, a milestone that represented trust, independence, and the beginning of their adult lives. What made this trip even more special was that it marked the first time Victor had allowed his daughters to use the family name's full resources. First-class tickets not as a display of wealth, but as a practical decision to ensure his daughters would be comfortable and well cared for during their important journey. The twins approached the Atlantic Premier Airlines check-in counter with the quiet confidence that came from excellent upbringings and legitimate business. Their boarding passes, printed at home, clearly showed seat assignments 2A and 2B. Their student IDs from Wellington Prep were pristine, their excitement barely contained beneath their composed exteriors. Kyle Manning looked up from his computer terminal with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of passengers. But when his eyes settled on the 2 young black women in front of him, something shifted in his demeanor. The professional smile became strained. The welcoming tone turned cautious. "Tickets and identification," he said, his voice notably cooler than it had been for the white family he just helped. Quincy placed their boarding passes and student IDs on the counter with careful precision. "Good morning. We're checking in for Flight 847 to New York." Kyle picked up their documents, his eyebrows rising as he examined the first-class seat assignments. He turned the boarding passes over, held them up to the light, and examined them with the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for suspected forgeries. "These don't look right," he announced loud enough for other passengers to hear. "Where did you get these tickets?" Sienna's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Our father purchased them directly from Atlantic Premier's website. Is there a problem?" Kyle's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll need to verify these." "Wait here." He disappeared into a back office, taking their documents with him. The twins stood at the counter for nearly 15 minutes while other passengers were processed efficiently around them. They could feel the stares, hear the whispered comments, sense the assumptions being made about 2 black teenagers with first-class tickets. When Kyle finally returned, he placed new boarding passes on the counter with an air of false authority. "There was an error in the system," he announced. "You've been reassigned to economy seats, gate 32. Quincy examined the new boarding passes, her brow furrowing. "But these aren't the seats our father booked. We're supposed to be in first class." Kyle leaned forward, lowering his voice with barely concealed hostility. "Listen, I don't know what kind of game you two are trying to play, but certain people need to understand that first class isn't for everyone. You should be grateful you're getting on the plane at all. The phrase certain people hung in the air like poison. There was no mistaking his meaning. Sienna's hands clenched at her sides, but Quincy placed a restraining hand on her sister's arm. They'd been taught that righteous anger from young black women was too often weaponized against them. Our father specifically purchased first-class tickets, Quincy insisted, keeping her voice level. I'd like to speak to a supervisor, please. Kyle's smile turned predatory. Supervisor's busy. If you have a problem with your seats, you can take it up at the gate next. Humiliated and angry, the twins collected their altered boarding passes and moved away from the counter. Other passengers stared as they passed, some with sympathy, others with the smug satisfaction of having their assumptions confirmed. We should call Dad, Sienna whispered. No, Quincy replied firmly. He has that board meeting today. He specifically asked us not to call unless it was an emergency. This feels like an emergency to me. We'll handle it ourselves, Quincy assured her sister, though doubt crept into her voice. Let's get through security first. But what they didn't know was that Kyle Manning was already on the phone with security, painting a picture of two suspicious teenagers who had tried to use fraudulent tickets. The discrimination they just experienced was only the beginning. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about traveling while black. The TSA security checkpoint should have been routine. Quincy and Sienna had flown before, knew the procedures, and had packed carefully to avoid any complications. But as they approached the screening area, they noticed something troubling. White passengers were moving through with minimal fuss, while travelers who looked like them were being subjected to additional screening with suspicious frequency. Random selection for enhanced screening, announced Agent Madison Pierce, though there was nothing random about the way her eyes had tracked the twins from the moment they entered the security area. The twins were directed to a separate screening lane, away from the general flow of passengers. Their carefully packed belongings were dumped onto tables for inspection. Agent Pierce's hands were rough as she poured through their personal items, examining their electronics with exaggerated suspicion. What's this? Pierce demanded, holding up Quincy's laptop. It's a laptop for school, Quincy replied calmly. I need it for my college interviews. Pierce opened the device, scrolling through files with no legal authority to do so. Lot of legal documents on here. You some kind of activist? The question was loaded with accusation. Quincy's legal documents were research papers for her AP government class and scholarship application essays, the normal academic work of a high-achieving student. I'm interested in law, Quincy answered carefully. Those are school assignments, Pierce's expression suggested. She didn't believe a word of it. She spent additional time examining every item, creating a spectacle that drew stares from other passengers. When she discovered Sienna's prescription allergy medication, she held up the bottle like she'd found contraband. What are these pills? Fexofenadine, Sienna explained patiently, for seasonal allergies. The prescription information is right on the bottle. But Pierce was already calling for a supervisor, creating unnecessary drama around standard medication that was clearly labeled and legally prescribed. The enhanced pat-down that followed was invasive and humiliating. The agent's hands lingered in ways that made both girls uncomfortable, while loud comments about their hair and clothing created a public spectacle. Always have to be extra careful with these types, Pierce announced to her colleague, as if the twins couldn't hear every word. You never know what they might be hiding. A white woman in line pulled out her phone to record the obvious harassment, but was immediately approached by security and forced to delete the footage. Any potential witnesses to the discriminatory treatment were quickly silenced. By the time they were cleared to proceed, 45 minutes had passed. Their belongings had been carelessly repacked. Quincy's laptop showed new scratches, and they were now cutting it close to their boarding time. Have a nice flight, Pierce said with mock sweetness. Better hurry. I hear they're strict about boarding times at gate 32. As they rushed toward their gate, Sienna pulled out her phone. We need to call Dad now. This has gone beyond ridiculous. Quincy checked the time and shook her head. He's in that closed-door session with the board right now. His assistant said he couldn't be disturbed for any reason. We'll handle this ourselves and tell him everything when he calls tonight. They didn't know that their father, Victor Sinclair, was actually sitting in the CEO's office of Atlantic Premier Airlines at that very moment, conducting his monthly assessment of company culture. As the airline's chief executive, a position he kept private to shield his family from unwanted attention. He was reviewing customer service reports that painted a concerning picture of the very discrimination his daughters were experiencing. The twins hurried through the terminal, their earlier excitement about the college trip now replaced by a growing sense of dread. They'd encountered this kind of treatment before, but never so systematically, never with such obvious coordination between different airline departments. At Skyway's Cafe, their attempt to grab a quick meal before boarding was met with the same hostility they'd experienced elsewhere. The hostess, Paige Sterling, looked up from her phone with barely concealed disgust when she saw them approaching. "How many?" she asked, her tone noticeably different from the warm greetings she'd given the white couple just ahead of them. "Two, please," Quincy replied politely. Paige made a show of checking her tablet. "There's going to be about a 45-minute wait." Sienna glanced around the restaurant at the numerous empty tables, clearly visible throughout the dining area. "But there are several open tables right there." "Those are reserved," Paige replied curtly, not bothering to look up. "Your website says you don't take reservations," Quincy pointed out, pulling up the restaurant's page on her phone. "It clearly states that seating is first come, first served." Paige's face flushed with irritation. "Well, the website is outdated. We do take reservations now, and all those tables are spoken for." As if choreographed, a white couple walked in behind the twins. Without acknowledging the ongoing conversation, Paige brightened immediately. "Two right this way." She grabbed menus and led the couple to one of the supposedly reserved tables, seating them with efficiency and warmth that contrasted sharply with the hostility she'd shown the twins. "Excuse me," Sienna called after her, her patience wearing thin. "We were here first, and you just told us there were no tables available." Paige turned with obvious annoyance. "Is there a problem?" The manager, Lance Morrison, appeared as if he'd been waiting for this moment. His name tag identified him clearly, but his demeanor suggested he'd already decided how this interaction would end. "These girls are causing a disruption," Paige explained quickly. "I told them we have a waiting list, but they're demanding immediate seating." "That's not what happened," Quincy interjected calmly. "Your hostess told us there was a 45-minute wait, but there are clearly open tables, and she just seated people who arrived after us." Morrison's expression didn't change. He hadn't taken his eyes off the twins since he'd arrived, hadn't even glanced at the empty tables or the newly seated couple. "I understand you're upset, but I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voices," he said, though both girls had been speaking calmly. "We have customers trying to enjoy their meals." The threat was implicit but clear: comply or face consequences. Rosa Kingsley, a Latina server, watched the interaction with growing concern. She approached cautiously, clearly wanting to help. "Lance, I can seat them at one of my tables. Number 12 just opened up." "Stay out of this, Rosa," Morrison snapped without looking at her. "Go check on your other customers." Rosa hesitated, torn between following orders and doing what was right. With an apologetic glance at the twins, she retreated, but not before discreetly slipping her business card into Quincy's hand, a small act of solidarity that would prove important later. "Look," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I suggest you find somewhere else to eat. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, and right now you're not welcome here." The message was unmistakable. This wasn't about restaurant policies or wait times. It was about who belonged in first-class establishments and who didn't. Hungry, frustrated, and increasingly demoralized, the twins turned to leave. But Rosa's small act of kindness, her willingness to be a witness to what she'd seen, gave them hope that not everyone in the system was complicit in the discrimination they were facing. As they walked toward their gate, using Roz's food vouchers for a quick meal from a vending machine, they had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Little did anyone know what was waiting for them at Gate 32. Gate 32 was bustling with pre-boarding activity when Quincy and Sienna arrived. Atlantic Premier Flight 847 to LaGuardia was on schedule, and passengers were already queuing for the premium boarding process. The twins checked their boarding passes one final time. Economy seats 24E and 24E, a far cry from the first-class accommodations their father had purchased. But something didn't sit right with Quincy. She pulled out her phone and accessed her email, scrolling through until she found their original booking confirmation. The discrepancy was clear. Victor Sinclair had indeed purchased seats 2A and 2B in first class, not the economy assignments they'd been given. "Look at this," she whispered to Sienna, showing her the screen. "Dad's confirmation email shows first class. Kyle Manning lied to us." Sienna's jaw tightened. "So what do? We can't exactly force our way onto the plane. We document everything," Quincy decided, her voice taking on the methodical tone that had made her Wellington Prep's star debate team captain. "If we're going to fight this, we need evidence." They approached the customer service desk adjacent to the gate, where a harried agent named Olivia Peaton was processing passenger requests with mechanical efficiency. When the twins presented their case, original confirmation email versus current boarding passes, Olivia barely looked up from her computer screen. "The check-in agent made the appropriate adjustments," she said dismissively. "If there was an error in your original booking, it's been corrected now." "But here's the email confirmation," Quincy insisted, showing her the screen. "My father specifically purchased first-class seats. This isn't an error. It's an unauthorized change." Olivia finally looked up, her expression suggesting she was being asked to solve an impossibly complex problem rather than a simple seating discrepancy. "I don't see any record of a complaint being filed," she said. "And even if there was an error, first class is full now. There's nothing I can do." It was a lie, and they all knew it. The first-class cabin on this route was never full on a Tuesday morning, and Olivia had the authority to restore their original seats with a few keystrokes. But she wasn't going to use that authority for two black teenagers who, in her mind, probably didn't belong in first class anyway. Sienna pulled out her phone to document the interaction, but Olivia immediately became hostile. "Recording in the gate area isn't permitted," she snapped. "Put that away or I'll call security." "We're not recording the gate area," Sienna replied calmly. "We're documenting our customer service interaction for potential complaints. Put it away." The twins exchanged glances. They were being systematically stonewalled at every turn, but they weren't going to give up. As boarding began, they watched first-class passengers glide through the priority lane with barely a glance at their documentation. When general boarding was announced, they joined the line with resignation, hoping that at least they'd be able to reach New York and salvage their college interviews. But Parker Whitfield, the gate agent scanning boarding passes, had other plans. When the twins reached the front of the line, Parker examined their passes with exaggerated scrutiny. He held them up to the light, compared them to something on his computer screen, and frowned as if he'd discovered a major discrepancy. "There seems to be a problem here," he announced loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "Please step aside while I verify these boarding passes." "What kind of problem?" Quincy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "These passes appear to have been altered," Parker claimed. "I'm going to need to see additional identification." It was an absurd accusation. The boarding passes had been issued by Kyle Manning just hours earlier and showed no signs of tampering. But Parker was creating a scene, drawing attention to the twins and painting them as potential security threats. "These are our student IDs from Wellington Preparatory Academy," Sienna explained, producing their identification cards. "They have the school seal, our photos, and official signatures." Parker inspected the IDs with theatrical suspicion. "Student IDs can be easily fabricated. I need something more official." "We're 17, Quincy pointed out. "We don't have driver's licenses yet." The airline confirmed these IDs were sufficient when our father booked the tickets. Parker reached for his radio. "Security to gate 32, please. Security to gate 32. The announcement echoed through the terminal, causing nearby passengers to stare and whisper. Some pulled out phones to record what appeared to be the apprehension of two teenage criminals. "This is discrimination," Sienna stated firmly, no longer willing to pretend this was all just a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. "We have legitimate tickets and ID. You're delaying us because we're black." Parker's face flushed red. "That's a serious accusation, young lady. I could have you removed from this airport for making false claims against airline personnel." But before the situation could escalate further, a new voice entered the conversation. "What seems to be the problem here, Parker?" The woman who approached was perhaps in her 50s, with dark skin and hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name tag identified her as Simone Bradford's supervisor. For a moment, the twins felt a surge of hope. Surely another black woman would understand what was happening and intervene on their behalf. They couldn't have been more wrong. Simone Bradford had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder at Atlantic Premier Airlines. She'd learned early that survival in the system meant not making waves, not challenging the status quo, and certainly not taking the side of passengers who complained about discrimination. She'd become exactly what the airline wanted, a black face providing cover for policies that disproportionately affected people who looked like her. These two are claiming their boarding passes were fraudulent, Parker explained, deliberately mischaracterizing the situation. They're making accusations of discrimination when I'm simply following security protocols. Simone examined their boarding passes and IDs with the same suspicion her white colleagues had shown, her expression suggesting she was dealing with troublemakers rather than legitimate passengers. "Is there some reason you can't follow standard boarding procedures like everyone else?" she asked, her tone sharp with disapproval. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Here was someone who should have understood, should have recognized the pattern of treatment they'd experienced, instead helping to perpetuate the very system that oppressed them all. "We've been following procedures all day," Quincy replied carefully. "We've been subjected to additional screening at every step, had our tickets illegally changed, and now we're being accused of fraud for trying to board with legitimate passes." Simone's expression hardened. "I don't appreciate the attitude, young lady. If you continue making accusations, I'll be forced to deny you boarding entirely." The threat was clear. Shut up and accept the mistreatment or face even worse consequences. Quincy looked at her sister, seeing her own defeat reflected in Sienna's eyes. They were tired, hungry, and running out of options. Their college interviews were scheduled for tomorrow morning, and missing this flight would mean missing opportunities they'd worked years to earn. "Fine," Quincy said quietly. "We'll board, Georgie." But as Parker scanned their passes and they walked down the jet bridge, both twins were documenting everything in their phones. They might have been forced to accept this treatment today, but they weren't going to let it end here. What they didn't know was that one final humiliation awaited them before they could reach their seats. That's when the real truth about Atlantic Premier's training program emerged. The jet bridge stretched ahead like a gauntlet, and at its end stood one final obstacle to their journey. Logan Cartwright, Atlantic Premier's onboard services coordinator, examined boarding passes with the lazy authority of someone who'd made snap judgments about passengers for years. Most travelers flowed past him with minimal interaction. A quick glance at their pass, a nod, and they were through. But when Quincy and Sienna approached, Logan's demeanor shifted into the now familiar pattern of suspicion and hostility they'd encountered all morning. "Hold on there," he said, stepping directly into their path. "I need to double-check something." He took their boarding passes and made a show of examining them against a printed manifest, though it was clear he was simply stalling. Other passengers were forced to wait behind them, creating exactly the kind of public embarrassment that had characterized their entire airport experience. "These seats were supposed to be assigned to other passengers," Logan announced, though he was reading from no official document. "There seems to be some confusion about your reservations." Quincy's patience, worn thin by hours of systematic mistreatment, finally reached its breaking point. "There's no confusion," she said, her voice steady but firm. "These are the seats we were assigned after our original first-class tickets were illegally downgraded. We've been harassed, delayed, and discriminated against at every step of this process, and we're not going to accept any more lies." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Logan's face flushed with anger. No one, especially not a black teenager, spoke to him with such directness. "That's it," he snapped, reaching for his radio. "Security to Jet Bridge 32. Passenger removal required." Within minutes, two security guards appeared. Tom Bennett and Frank Miller, both approaching with the aggressive posture of men who'd already decided the twins were the problem. "What seems to be the issue?" Bennett asked, addressing Logan rather than the twins. "These two are refusing to accept their seat assignments and making accusations against airline staff," Logan explained, painting a completely false picture of the situation. "They're becoming disruptive and interfering with boarding procedures." "We are not being disruptive," Sienna protested. "We're simply trying to understand why our legitimate tickets keep being questioned and changed." Miller, the larger of the two guards, stepped forward with obvious intimidation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and cooperate with airline personnel." "We've been cooperating all day," Quincy replied, her voice remaining calm despite her rising anger. We've submitted to illegal searches, accepted unauthorized changes to our tickets, and endured systematic harassment. We're not going to be intimidated into silence anymore. The jet bridge had become a public theater with other passengers recording on their phones as the situation escalated. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed convinced they were witnessing the apprehension of actual troublemakers. Recording security procedures is prohibited, Bennett declared. Though no security procedure was actually taking place, I need everyone to put their phones away immediately. It was a lie designed to eliminate witnesses, but several passengers continued recording anyway, sensing they were witnessing something important. Logan pulled out a printed manifest and made a show of consulting it, though everyone knew he was simply trying to justify his earlier claims. According to this document, these seats were reassigned due to overbooking, he announced. These passengers will need to take alternative arrangements. The flight isn't overbooked, Quincy stated flatly. I can see empty seats in first class through the aircraft door. You're removing us because you don't think we belong here. The accusation of racism hung in the air, and Logan's reaction confirmed its accuracy. His face contorted with rage at having his motivations called out so directly. That's enough, he snarled. You two are banned from this flight. Security, escort them off the aircraft immediately. But Quincy wasn't finished. With the calm precision that had made her Wellington Prep Star student, she pulled out her phone and began making a call. We're calling our father, she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. Something in her tone, not pleading, not desperate, but coldly certain, made everyone pause. Logan, who had been gesturing dramatically to security, stopped mid-motion. The guards who had been moving to physically remove the twins hesitated because for the first time all day, Quincy Beaumont sounded like someone who had real power. Dad, she said when the call connected, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. We're at Atlanta Airport, and Atlantic Premier Airlines is refusing to honor our tickets. We need your help. The voice that answered was calm, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Quincy, sweetheart, tell me exactly what's happening. Take your time. Logan tried to interrupt. Miss, you can't make phone calls on the jet bridge. Mr. Cartwright, the voice from the phone cut him off with icy precision. This is Victor Sinclair. You will not interrupt my daughter again. The blood drained from Logan's face. Victor Sinclair wasn't just any concerned parent. He was Atlantic Premier Airlines Chief Executive Officer. The twins looked at each other in surprise. They knew their father was successful, but they'd never fully understood the extent of his influence in the aviation industry. Now Victor continued, his voice carrying across the jet bridge for everyone to hear. I want you to listen very carefully to what my daughters are about to tell you, because what you've done today isn't just wrong. It's about to cost Atlantic Premier Airlines everything. The silence that followed was absolute. Security guards stepped back. Logan looked like he might faint. Other passengers pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Quincy Sienna, Victor said gently, document everything that happened today. Every name, every incident, every witness, because we're not just getting you home. We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. And in that moment, everyone realized they had treated exactly the wrong family with such prejudice. What they discovered next would destroy everything Atlantic Premier Airlines thought it knew about power. The jet bridge fell into stunned silence as the implications of Victor Sinclair's identity sank in. Logan Cartwright, who moments before had been aggressively confronting two teenagers, now looked like a man facing his own execution. The security guards stepped back, suddenly uncertain about their authority. Other passengers pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Girls, Victor's voice carried clearly through the phone speaker, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't move. Don't accept any offers from airline staff and keep recording everything. I'm implementing Emergency Protocol Alpha right now. Quincy and Sienna exchanged confused glances. What's Protocol Alpha, Dad? Sienna asked. You'll see in about 2 minutes, Victor replied grimly. And everyone who treated you like criminals today is about to learn why I kept my position in this company private. The twins had always known their father worked in aviation, but they'd assumed he was a regional manager or director. The revelation that he was the CEO of Atlantic Premier Airlines, one of America's largest carriers, recontextualized everything that had happened to them. Victor had deliberately kept his role secret, even from his daughters, as part of his comprehensive strategy to assess the company's culture without the artificial deference his title would command. He'd taken the CEO position 6 months earlier with a mandate from the board to transform Atlantic Premier's reputation and profitability. What he'd discovered during his covert observations had been deeply troubling, but he'd needed concrete evidence before taking action. His daughters had just provided that evidence in the most personal way possible. Mr. Cartwright, Victor continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of executive authority, you and your colleagues have just subjected the CEO's daughters to systematic racial discrimination. More importantly, you've revealed exactly how Atlantic Premier treats Black customers when you think no one important is watching. Logan's face had gone pale. He tried to speak, but no words came. Quincy Sienna, Victor said, I need you to understand something. What happened to you today wasn't random. It wasn't a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. It was a systematic pattern of behavior that this company has allowed to flourish because people like Mr. Cartwright believed they could treat certain customers differently without consequences. The twins began to comprehend the scope of what they'd experienced. This wasn't just about their individual mistreatment. It was about a corporate culture that had institutionalized discrimination. But Dad, Quincy said, if you're the CEO, why didn't you know this was happening? Because, Victor replied with bitter honesty, people behave differently when they know the boss is watching. I suspected we had problems, but I needed to see how employees actually treated customers when they thought their actions wouldn't be scrutinized. Today I got that evidence. Other passengers were now openly recording the conversation, understanding they were witnessing a corporate reckoning in real time. Some looked ashamed, realizing they'd witnessed discrimination without intervening. Others seemed amazed at the sudden reversal of power dynamics. Logan finally found his voice. Mr. Sinclair, there's been a misunderstanding. We were just following standard security procedures. Mr. Cartwright, Victor's voice cut through the excuse like ice. I have recordings of everything that happened to my daughters today. Kyle Manning at check-in illegally downgraded their tickets. Madison Pierce at security subjected them to invasive searches based solely on their race. Parker Whitfield at the gate created false security alerts, and who just attempted to remove paying passengers from an aircraft for the crime of expecting the service they purchased. Each name Victor mentioned hit like a hammer blow. The twins realized their father had been tracking their experience in real time, gathering evidence while they suffered through each humiliation. Furthermore, Victor continued, I have documentation showing that this pattern of behavior isn't isolated to today. Customer service reports, discrimination complaints, and employee testimonials have painted a clear picture of systematic bias that this company has not just tolerated, but actively enabled. The departure boards throughout the terminal began flickering with updates. Flight after flight started showing the same status. Delayed gate return. What's happening to the flights? Someone asked. Victor's voice carried a grim satisfaction. Emergency Protocol Alpha means every Atlantic Premier aircraft currently on the tarmac or at gates is being recalled. Passengers already boarded are being returned to terminals. Every flight in our entire system is being grounded, pending immediate investigation. The magnitude of the response left everyone speechless. Victor had just paralyzed one of America's largest airlines, over 400 aircraft serving more than 50,000 passengers daily in response to the discrimination his daughters had faced. Sir, Logan stammered, surely this is an overreaction to what was just a customer service issue. A customer service issue? Victor's voice carried dangerous calm. Mr. Cartwright, my daughters documented systematic racial discrimination by at least 6 Atlantic Premier employees. They were harassed, humiliated, and threatened with arrest for the crime of being young, Black, and successful. That's not a customer service issue. That's a civil rights violation that exposes decades of institutional racism this company has hidden from its board, its shareholders, and the public. Emergency announcements began echoing through the terminal as the grounding took effect. Confused passengers approached gate agents demanding explanations. The ripple effects were spreading beyond Atlanta to every airport Atlantic Premier served. Now, Victor continued, I want every employee who interacted with my daughters today to report to the airport's administrative offices immediately. We're going to have a very public conversation about Atlantic Premier's treatment of minority passengers, and it's going to be recorded for regulatory review. Logan looked desperately at the security guards, but they were already backing away. Nobody wanted to be associated with the discrimination that had triggered this crisis. Quincy Sienna, Victor said, his voice softening. You're not getting on that plane today. Instead, you're going to help me transform this entire industry, because what happened to you happens to thousands of people every day. And today, it stops. They are saint. But what the twins didn't know was that powerful forces were already mobilizing to stop their father's investigation and protect the system that had enabled their mistreatment. What happened next would shock everyone. While chaos erupted at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, an emergency meeting was convening in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Atlantic Premier's Manhattan headquarters. The company's largest investor, Preston Harrington, stared at the financial report streaming across his multiple monitors with barely controlled rage. Every grounded flight was costing the airline approximately $50,000 per hour. With over 400 aircraft affected, the immediate financial impact was approaching $20 million, and the numbers were climbing every minute. But the monetary losses paled in comparison to the reputational damage that was beginning to spread across social media and news outlets. Get me Stephanie Reynolds in operations, Preston barked at his assistant, and conference in the other board members, everyone except Sinclair. Preston had opposed Victor's appointment as CEO from the beginning, arguing behind closed doors that the former tech executive lacked the cultural understanding necessary to run a major airline. What he'd meant, though he would never say it directly, was that a black CEO didn't belong at the helm of Atlantic Premier Airlines. He'd been outvoted by board members desperate for Victor's reputation as a turnaround specialist. But he'd never accepted the decision. Now Victor had handed him the perfect opportunity to rectify that mistake. Stephanie, I need you to handle something delicate, Preston said when Atlantic Premier's VP of Operations answered his call. Sinclair's daughters are still at Denver International, and they're the source of this entire crisis. I need them isolated and contained before they can cause any more damage. Stephanie Reynolds had climbed the corporate ladder by understanding exactly what executives like Preston wanted, even when they couldn't say it explicitly. What exactly do you want me to do? Get them away from public view. Offer them the VIP treatment, whatever it takes, but get them somewhere private where they can't talk to the press or post on social media. Frame it as protection from the chaos their father has caused. Stephanie understood perfectly. The twins needed to be silenced before their story gained more traction. Preston's next call was to Calvin Hughes, Atlantic Premier's IT director. I need everything those girls have done today erased. Security footage, ticket records, employee reports, everything. Make it look like a system glitch if anyone asks. Calvin hesitated. Sir, that would involve altering official records. If this becomes a legal matter, it involves protecting this company from a rogue CEO who's abusing his authority, Preston corrected sharply. The board will back you up. Just do it. Within an hour, Preston had orchestrated a comprehensive counteroffensive. The airline's PR team began seeding stories about disruptive teenagers, causing a scene at Atlanta Airport. Social media accounts with connections to Atlantic Premier started questioning the twins' character, suggesting they had manipulated their father into an overreaction. News outlets were receiving press releases emphasizing the economic impact of the grounding, while dismissing the discrimination claims as unverified allegations currently under internal review. Meanwhile, Stephanie Reynolds had arrived at Atlanta Airport with a security detail and was approaching the twins with what appeared to be genuine concern. Quincy Sienna, she greeted them warmly, as if they were old friends. I'm Stephanie Reynolds, VP of Operations. I can't tell you how deeply disturbed I am by what I'm hearing about your experience today. Her smile seemed sincere, her body language open and sympathetic. Behind her stood 4 security guards positioned at a discreet distance, but clearly part of her entourage. Your father asked me to personally ensure your comfort and safety while this situation is resolved, she continued. We've prepared our VIP lounge for you, away from all this chaos. Private bathrooms, comfortable seating, refreshments, anything you need. Quincy, still on the phone with Victor, gave Stephanie a measured look. Dad, Stephanie Reynolds is here. She wants to take us to the VIP lounge. There was a pause before Victor responded, his voice tinged with suspicion. Put her on speaker. When Stephanie heard Victor's voice, her smile faltered almost imperceptibly before she recovered. Victor, I'm so glad we connected. I just want to assure you that I had no idea about any of this until I got your emergency alert. I'm horrified, truly horrified, and I'm here to personally make sure your daughters are taken care of. That's very thoughtful, Stephanie, Victor replied, his tone carefully neutral. But my instructions to Quincy and Sienna were explicit. They are to remain in public view in the main terminal, where they can be seen by other passengers, and where any interactions with airline staff will have witnesses. Stephanie's smile tightened. Of course, I understand your concern, but really with all the commotion and media attention gathering, it might be safer and more comfortable for them in the lounge. Actually, Sienna interjected, we're quite comfortable right here, but thank you for your concern. Stephanie's carefully crafted facade began to crack. She leaned closer to the twins, lowering her voice so that only they and their father on the phone could hear. Listen carefully. Your father has created a major crisis for this airline. Thousands of passengers are stranded. Millions of dollars are being lost, and his position is becoming very precarious. The smart move for your family would be to quietly accept our hospitality and allow the adults to resolve this situation professionally. The threat beneath her words was unmistakable. Is that a threat to my daughter? Stephanie Victor asked through the phone, his voice dangerously quiet. Stephanie straightened, realizing she had miscalculated. Not at all, Victor. I'm simply concerned about their well-being in this chaotic environment. Then you'll understand why they're staying exactly where they are, following my explicit instructions, Victor replied. And Stephanie, the next time you attempt to intimidate my children, clear out your office first. It will save you a trip back to collect your things later. The line went dead, leaving Stephanie staring at the twins with barely concealed fury. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her security detail following. But the twins didn't know that Stephanie was immediately calling Preston Harrington, reporting that direct intimidation had failed and recommending they accelerate to more aggressive tactics. The battle was expanding beyond the airport into a broader war for control of Atlantic Premier Airlines. What they also couldn't know was that their social media accounts were already under attack with fabricated posts appearing to paint them as entitled troublemakers who had manipulated their father into overreacting. Little did anyone know what came next. Calvin Hughes stared at his computer screen in Atlantic Premier's IT department, his hands trembling slightly as he processed Preston Harrington's instructions. Erasing security footage and altering passenger records wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. But the pressure from the board was immense, and his job was on the line. As he initiated the deletion protocols, a notification popped up on his screen. Access denied. Security protocol alpha active. Calvin frowned. He had administrative privileges that should override any standard security protocols. He tried again with the same result. Then he noticed something else. A small icon in the corner of his screen indicating active monitoring of his system. Someone was watching his every move. His phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. Mr. Hughes came a calm, intelligent voice when he answered. This is Quincy Beaumont. I believe you're trying to access security footage from Atlanta Airport. Calvin nearly dropped the phone in shock. How did you get this number? How are you monitoring my system? I'm something of a programmer myself, Quincy replied with matter-of-fact confidence. Dad's mentioned you before, said you were one of the most ethical people in the IT department. That's why I'm calling instead of just logging your attempts to alter evidence. Calvin's mind raced. He hadn't considered that Victor Sinclair's daughter might have technical skills of her own, or that she'd been anticipating corporate attempts to cover up what had happened. Look, this is a misunderstanding, he began weakly. No misunderstanding, Quincy cut him off. I've been backing up evidence all day. Every interaction, every recording, every ticket change is stored on secure cloud servers that neither you nor Mr. Harrington can access. I've also written scripts that are scanning social media for any altered posts, supposedly from our accounts. Did you know impersonation is a federal offense, Mr. Hughes? Calvin felt sweat beading on his forehead. I'm just following orders from Preston Harrington, not from the CEO, Quincy corrected. You have a choice right now. You can continue trying to erase evidence of racial discrimination, which is itself illegal, or you can do the right thing. While Quincy was handling the IT director, Sienna had been reaching out to witnesses they'd encountered throughout the day. Rosa Kingsley, the sympathetic server from Skyways Cafe, had responded immediately to Sienna's message. I've been documenting Lance Morrison's behavior for months, Rosa wrote. I've attached recordings I made secretly of him making racist comments about customers after you left. He told me to stop helping those people because they don't belong in first-class establishments. Other passengers who had witnessed their treatment at various checkpoints were finding them on social media, sending their own recordings and statements of support. The digital evidence was mounting, creating a counter-narrative to the corporate spin that Preston was trying to establish. But the attack on their reputation was intensifying as well. Fabricated social media posts, supposedly from the twins, accounts began circulating, showing them bragging about manipulating their father, making racist comments of their own, and displaying entitled behavior that played into every negative stereotype. Quincy, anticipating this exact tactic, had already contacted Wellington Prep's IT administrator, Ms. Chen, who had mentored her in advanced programming. Together, they verified and published the twins' actual social media history, complete with timestamps and metadata that proved the recent posts were fabricated. These fake accounts were created within the last 2 hours, Quincy posted on her verified Twitter account. The IP addresses trace back to Atlantic Premier's corporate offices. Screenshot everything before they delete the evidence. The digital battle was becoming a public spectacle. Tech-savvy supporters began analyzing the fake posts, exposing the clumsy attempts at character assassination. Meanwhile, the authentic recordings and witness statements were creating an undeniable pattern of systematic discrimination. Preston Harrington watched his carefully orchestrated cover-up collapse in real time. Not only had the twins anticipated his moves, but they'd turned his tactics against him, generating even more negative publicity for Atlantic Premier. Sir, his assistant reported nervously, the #Atlantic Premier discrimination is trending nationally. We're getting thousands of reports from other passengers sharing their own experiences with discrimination on our flights. What had begun as an attempt to silence two teenagers had opened the floodgates to a much larger conversation about racism in the airline industry. Current and former Atlantic Premier employees were coming forward with their own stories, describing a corporate culture where discriminatory behavior was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. Calvin Hughes made his decision. Instead of erasing evidence, he began securing it, placing copies on protected servers where even executive access couldn't delete them. He sent Victor Sinclair a direct message. I'm preserving the evidence, not destroying it. I'll testify if needed. It was a career-risking move, but as he watched the coordinated attack on two innocent teenagers escalate, he couldn't be part of it any longer. By evening, what had begun as Preston's counteroffensive had transformed into a digital uprising. The hashtag was trending globally with airline passengers from around the world sharing similar experiences of discrimination. The twins' systematic documentation of their experience, combined with the obvious attempts to silence them, had created exactly the kind of authenticity that resonated across social media platforms. Preston's boardroom conspiracy was crumbling, but he had one final card to play, an emergency meeting that could determine not just Victor's future, but the direction of Atlantic Premier Airlines itself. What they discovered next would destroy everything. The Atlantic Premier Airlines emergency board meeting convened virtually at 8:00 p.m. Eastern, with 14 grim-faced executives appearing on screens across the country. Preston Harrington had spent the afternoon securing tentative support for his motion to remove Victor Sinclair as CEO, framing the crisis as an emotional overreaction that was destroying shareholder value. Colleagues, Preston began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who believed he was saving the company. We face an unprecedented crisis. Our CEO has grounded our entire fleet over what appears to be a personal family matter, potentially violating his fiduciary duty to this company and its shareholders. The stock price had fallen 18% since the grounding began, and the financial losses were mounting by the hour. Several board members nodded in agreement, their concern evident as Preston built his case methodically. I move that we temporarily relieve Victor Sinclair of his duties, pending a full investigation into his actions today. This isn't about race, as some are already suggesting in the media. This is about sound business judgment and fiscal responsibility. Before anyone could second the motion, Victor appeared on screen, his expression calm but determined. The background behind him showed not his usual office, but what appeared to be a conference room filled with documents and multiple computer screens. "Before you vote on Mr. Harrington's motion," Victor said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "I believe you should have all the facts." He pressed a button, and his screen was replaced by a series of documents, charts, and images that made several board members lean closer to their monitors. "What you're seeing is a comprehensive report on discrimination complaints against Atlantic Premier Airlines over the past 5 years," Victor continued. "Complaints that were systematically buried by previous management that was appointed during Mr. Harrington's tenure as executive chairman. The data was staggering. Discrimination complaints against Atlantic Premier were 340% higher than the industry average. Internal reports documenting this pattern had been deliberately concealed from the board and shareholders, creating massive legal and financial liabilities that could exceed $800 million. Preston's face flushed with anger. "This is a distraction from the matter at hand. Your emotional overreaction to your daughter's experience is costing this company millions." "My daughter's experience was not an isolated incident," Victor countered, his voice steady as steel. "It was a textbook example of the discriminatory culture that has festered within this airline for years, a culture that represents massive legal and financial liability that has been concealed from this board." He switched to another screen showing pending lawsuits and regulatory investigations. "These discrimination cases represent potential liabilities exceeding $800 million, none of which have been properly disclosed in our financial statements. That, Mr. Harrington, is a breach of fiduciary duty." The room fell silent as board members processed this revelation. Elena Kim, the board's audit committee chair, was the first to recover. "Victor, are you saying you were aware of these issues before today? When you hired me 6 months ago to turn this airline around, I began a comprehensive investigation into company culture and practices," Victor replied. "What I discovered was a systematic pattern of discrimination, buried complaints, and intimidation of employees who spoke up." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I was preparing a detailed plan to address these issues when my daughters experienced exactly the kind of treatment I'd been documenting. Their experience wasn't the reason for my actions today. It was the catalyst." Several board members were now watching Preston with new suspicion. The narrative was shifting from Victor's supposed overreaction to Preston's potential liability for the concealed problems. Furthermore, Victor continued, "Since implementing Protocol Alpha, I've discovered attempts to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and spread false information about my daughters online, all of which appear to trace back to Mr. Harrington's direct instructions." Preston's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "These are wild accusations to cover for your own incompetence. If you continue with these slanderous claims, I'll use every resource at my disposal to destroy you, Sinclair. Your reputation, your daughter's futures, everything." The threat hung in the air for a moment before Victor smiled coldly. "Thank you for that, Preston. I should mention that this entire meeting is being recorded as per company bylaws section 4.7, which requires documentation of all emergency board sessions. Would you like to rephrase your threat against my teenage daughters, or shall we let it stand for the record?" Preston realized too late that he had walked into a trap. His carefully constructed facade of reasonable concern had crumbled, revealing the uglier truth beneath. Board members who had been leaning toward his position were now shifting uncomfortably, distancing themselves from his increasingly unhinged demeanor. "Here's what's going to happen," Victor continued, his voice level but authoritative. "I'm implementing a comprehensive anti-discrimination program throughout Atlantic Premier, effective immediately. Every employee will undergo mandatory training. A third-party firm will investigate all past complaints, and our financial disclosures will be amended to properly reflect our legal liabilities." He looked directly at Preston through the camera. As for your motion to remove me, I welcome the vote. But let me be clear. If I'm removed, my first call will be to the SEC regarding the deliberate concealment of material financial liabilities. My second will be to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division regarding the systematic discrimination and subsequent cover-up attempts. The boardroom fell silent. Preston's motion died without a second. One by one, board members voiced their support for Victor's plan, eager to distance themselves from what was clearly becoming a legal and public relations disaster. By the meeting's end, even Preston had been forced to abstain rather than stand alone in opposition to the comprehensive reforms. But the real challenge was just beginning. The Atlantic premier discrimination story exploded across national news the following morning. What had begun as coverage of an unusual airline grounding had transformed into a major investigation of corporate discrimination practices. The twins, with their father's blessing, had published a detailed account of their experience, alongside all the evidence they'd gathered. Their post, simply titled, "What Happened to Us at Atlantic Premier Airlines," laid out each incident chronologically, supported by witness statements, recordings, timestamps, and documentation. It was measured in tone, factual rather than accusatory, and devastatingly effective because of that restraint. Within hours, Mark's Atlantic premier discrimination was the top trending topic nationally, with other victims of discrimination sharing their stories and creating an avalanche of testimony that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Kyle Manning, the check-in agent who had started the twins' ordeal, gave a defensive interview to a local Atlanta station that only worsened his position. "I was just following procedures," he insisted, though he could not specify which procedures required him to downgrade paying passengers' tickets or subject them to extra scrutiny. When pressed by the interviewer, his response, "Certain people don't know how to behave in first class," was caught on camera, confirming rather than refuting the accusations of bias. Madison Pierce, the TSA agent who had conducted the invasive security screening, was placed on administrative leave after multiple witnesses came forward, describing her pattern of targeting minority passengers for excessive searches. The body camera footage that she claimed didn't exist was discovered in archive files showing exactly the kind of biased treatment the twins had documented. Parker Whitfield, the gate agent who had created false security alerts, was transferred to desk duty pending investigation. His history of passenger complaints revealed a troubling pattern of aggressive behavior toward travelers who didn't fit his demographic profile. The restaurant manager, Lance Morrison, was suspended after Rosa Kingsley provided recordings of his racist comments about customers. Her secret documentation of his behavior over several months painted a picture of systematic bias that the restaurant chain could no longer ignore. But the most significant development was in the corporate offices where Preston Harrington's carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Major shareholders began publicly distancing themselves from his leadership, with several institutional investors calling for his immediate removal from the board. His business reputation, built over decades of ruthless efficiency, began crumbling as the recording of his threats against the twins spread virally. The audio clip of his rage-filled voice promising to destroy two teenage girls for speaking out against discrimination was played on every major news network, creating exactly the kind of public relations nightmare that ended corporate careers. Meanwhile, the employees who had discriminated against the twins found themselves facing an uncomfortable spotlight. Their attempts to justify their actions only made things worse as each interview revealed the depth of their bias and the systematic nature of the discrimination. Victor Sinclair held a live press conference from Atlantic Premier headquarters with Quincy and Sienna seated beside him. The image was powerful. A successful black family refusing to accept injustice, demanding accountability from institutions that had failed them. "What happened to my daughters was not an isolated incident," Victor stated firmly. "It was a symptom of a systemic problem that has gone unrest for far too long. Today that changes." He outlined a comprehensive plan to address discrimination within the airline. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff, transparent reporting of all discrimination complaints, establishment of a passenger bill of rights, and creation of an independent review board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary actions. Perhaps most surprisingly, he announced that the employees directly involved in discriminating against his daughters would not be summarily fired. Termination might feel satisfying in the moment, he explained, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. Instead, these employees will participate in creating and implementing our new anti-discrimination training program with their salaries during this period donated to civil rights organizations. True change requires education and accountability, not just punishment. The reaction to Victor's approach was mixed. Some praised his focus on systemic change rather than individual scapegoating, while others felt the employees deserved immediate termination. The twins themselves supported their father's decision. This isn't about ruining individual careers, Sienna explained in a brief statement. It's about changing a system that encourages and rewards discrimination. By mid-afternoon, the story had reached the White House, with the press secretary confirming that the Department of Transportation would be examining Atlantic Premier's compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Several members of Congress called for hearings on discrimination in the airline industry more broadly. The transformation that had begun with one phone call at a gate was now reshaping an entire industry. Other airlines, seeing the catastrophic damage to Atlantic Premier's reputation, began implementing their own anti-discrimination measures preemptively, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. If you believe that Quincy and Sienna deserve to be treated with the same respect as every other passenger, type respect below. 6 weeks after the incident at Atlanta Airport, Atlantic Premier Airlines looked like a completely different company. The transformation hadn't been easy. Changing a corporate culture that had enabled discrimination for decades required more than policy changes and training videos. It required a fundamental shift in how the company viewed its relationship with customers and employees. The Accountability Council that Victor had created was meeting in Atlantic Premier's Atlanta training facility, a diverse group of 20 people tasked with redesigning the airline's approach to customer service and human relations. The council included civil rights experts, customer service specialists, former victims of discrimination, and most surprisingly, the employees who had discriminated against the twins. Kyle Manning sat uncomfortably at the conference table, listening as Rosa Kingsley described the impact of workplace discrimination on employees who witnessed it but felt powerless to intervene. Every time I saw Lance make racist comments about customers, I died a little inside, Rosa explained. But I needed my job. I have 2 kids to support, so I stayed quiet and hated myself for it. Kyle shifted in his seat. 6 weeks of intensive workshops and testimonies had forced him to confront patterns in his own behavior that he'd previously rationalized away. The training wasn't just about learning new policies, it was about understanding the human impact of his actions. I never thought of myself as racist, Kyle admitted during one particularly difficult session. I thought I was just doing my job, following procedures. But listening to all these stories, I realized I was creating different procedures for different people based on assumptions I didn't even know I was making. Madison Pierce's transformation had been even more dramatic. The TSA agent who had subjected the twins to invasive screening was now working with federal authorities to identify patterns of bias in airport security procedures. I convinced myself that extra screening of certain passengers was keeping everyone safe, she said during a recorded interview that would become part of Atlantic Premier's training materials. But when I really examined my decisions, I realized I was screening people based on stereotypes, not actual security concerns. The most profound change was in Simone Bradford, the supervisor who had betrayed the twins' expectations by siding with the discriminatory system. As a Black woman who had adapted to institutional bias by enforcing its rules, she carried perhaps the heaviest burden of cognitive dissonance. Her breakthrough had come during a particularly difficult council session when a young Black flight attendant described being told by a supervisor to tone down her natural hairstyle because it made some passengers uncomfortable. I said those exact words to a new hire last year, Simone had admitted, her voice breaking. I told myself I was helping her succeed in the real world, but I was just perpetuating the same system that forced me to deny parts of myself to be accepted. The council's work was producing real results. Atlantic Premier had implemented the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in the airline industry. Every employee underwent mandatory training that went beyond superficial diversity exercises to address unconscious bias and bystander intervention. An anonymous reporting system allowed passengers and employees to flag concerning interactions without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, these reports were taken seriously with real consequences for verified discrimination. The airline had also made structural changes. Hiring and promotion practices were redesigned to reduce bias. Customer satisfaction metrics were adjusted to ensure they didn't penalize employees for enforcing rules equally across all passenger demographics. And perhaps most significantly, upper management compensation was now partially tied to discrimination metrics, creating financial incentives for executives to take the issue seriously. Financial analysts had initially predicted disaster, with some forecasting that Atlantic Premier would lose up to 20% of its market value as it diverted resources to social justice rather than operational efficiency. Preston Harrington, who had been forced to resign from the board after shareholder pressure, had been particularly vocal in predicting the airline's downfall. But something unexpected had happened. After an initial period of adjustment, Atlantic Premier's customer satisfaction scores had begun to rise across all demographic groups. Employee retention improved as staff reported feeling more valued and less conflicted about their work environment. The anticipated mass exodus of business customers never materialized. In fact, several major corporations specifically switched their travel contracts to Atlantic Premier, citing its ethical leadership as aligning with their own corporate values. "We are seeing something remarkable," Victor explained during a board meeting. "When you treat all customers with dignity and respect, when you create a workplace where employees feel valued regardless of their background, the entire operation improves." Discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was bad business. The twins had become powerful advocates for change, speaking at conferences and working with other companies to implement similar programs. Their story had inspired young people across the country, showing that individuals could challenge systems and create meaningful transformation. But their real test was coming. In 1 week, they would be flying Atlantic Premier, again from Atlanta to New York, to see if the changes were real or just corporate theater. The consequences were just beginning. Stories of courage and justice like Quincy and Sienna's inspire people all around the world. These young women prove that standing up for what's right can transform entire industries. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of dignity are reaching. 6 months after their initial experience, Quincy and Sienna Beaumont stood at Gate 32 in Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the same gate where they had been denied boarding, the same terminal where they had documented systematic discrimination, the same airline that had treated them as criminals for the crime of being young, Black, and successful. But everything was different now. The gate agent, a young South Asian woman named Priya Sharma, checked their boarding passes with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, ladies. New York today." She handed back their IDs without excessive scrutiny, treating them with the same casual efficiency she showed every passenger. "Yes," Quincy replied, still slightly amazed that this ordinary interaction, unremarkable to most travelers, represented such a profound change from their previous experience. They boarded the aircraft without incident, settling into their first-class seats as other passengers filed past. The transformation wasn't just in policies and procedures. It was in the basic human dignity that was now extended to every customer, regardless of their appearance or background. As they taxied toward the runway, Sienna looked out the window at the busy airport. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we just accepted that first ticket change?" she asked her sister. "Sometimes," Quincy admitted. "But then I remember Rose's recordings of Lance's racist comments or Calvin's testimony about being ordered to delete evidence, or all the other passengers who came forward with their stories. This was bigger than just us." The flight attendant making the safety announcement was Diane Washington, a Black woman whose natural hairstyle would have been deemed unprofessional under the old Atlantic Premier policies. She moved through the cabin with confidence and pride, representing the kind of authentic diversity the company now embraced rather than merely tolerated. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, the twins reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The discrimination they'd faced had been real and painful, but their response had created ripple effects they never could have imagined. Kyle Manning was now leading sensitivity training sessions for customer service representatives, using his own experience as an example of how unconscious bias could destroy customer relationships. His transformation from discriminatory agent to advocate for change had become a powerful testament to the possibility of redemption. Madison Pierce had become a federal consultant on airport security bias, working with the TSA to identify and eliminate discriminatory screening practices. Her expertise in recognizing the patterns she'd once perpetuated made her uniquely qualified to help prevent future incidents. Parker Whitfield had left the airline industry entirely, enrolling in a master's program in social work. His experience of being held accountable for his actions had led to profound personal change, and he was now dedicated to helping others examine their own biases. Simone Bradford had been promoted to Director of Customer Experience, leading Atlantic Premier's transformation efforts. Her journey from enabler to advocate had made her one of the most respected voices in corporate diversity initiatives. Even Lance Morrison, the restaurant manager who had banned them from Skyway's Cafe, had undergone significant change. The restaurant chain had implemented Atlantic Premier's anti-discrimination model across all their locations, with Lance serving as a case study in the training programs. But the changes went far beyond individual transformation. The airline industry as a whole had been forced to confront its treatment of minority passengers. Congressional hearings had led to new federal regulations, requiring transparent reporting of discrimination complaints. Other airlines had implemented their own accountability measures, though none as comprehensive as Atlantic Premier's. The twins had testified before Congress, spoken at universities, and worked with civil rights organizations to expand their model to other industries. Their story had become a catalyst for broader conversations about institutional discrimination and the power of individual action to create systemic change. As their flight approached LaGuardia Airport, Quincy opened her laptop to review her notes for tomorrow's presentation at Columbia Law School. She was a freshman now, having deferred her admission by a year to work on anti-discrimination advocacy. Sienna was at NYU's business school focusing on corporate ethics and social responsibility. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into New York," came the captain's voice over the intercom. "On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with Atlantic Premier Airlines. We know you have choices in air travel, and we appreciate your trust in us to provide not just safe transportation, but service that honors the dignity of every passenger." The words were more than corporate script. They represented a fundamental shift in how the airline viewed its mission. Transportation wasn't just about moving people from one place to another. It was about treating every human being with respect and dignity. As they deplaned at LaGuardia, the twins were approached by a young black girl, perhaps 8 years old, traveling with her family. "Are you the sisters who changed the airplane company?" she asked with innocent directness. Quincy knelt down to the child's eye level. "We're Quincy and Sienna. What's your name?" "I'm Zoe. My mom said you made it so people like us get treated nice on airplanes." Sienna felt tears forming in her eyes. This child would never know the fear and humiliation they had experienced. She would travel through the world with one less barrier, one less source of anxiety, one less reason to feel like a second-class citizen. "That's right, Zoe," Quincy said gently. "And you know what? If anyone ever treats you unfairly, you can speak up too. Your voice matters." The child nodded solemnly and ran back to her parents, who smiled gratefully at the twins before disappearing into the crowd. As they walked through the terminal toward their next chapter, Quincy and Sienna knew that their experience had created something bigger than individual justice. They had helped build a world where that little girl and countless others like her could travel with dignity. What happened next would surprise everyone about the power of truth. 1 year after the incident that had grounded Atlantic Premier Airlines, the transformation extended far beyond a single company or industry. The Atlantic Premier model had become a template for addressing institutional discrimination across corporate America, with over 200 companies implementing similar accountability programs. The twins were featured on the cover of Time magazine's Future Leaders issue, but they had never lost sight of why they'd fought so hard in that Atlanta terminal. It wasn't about personal recognition. It was about systemic change that would outlast any individual story. At a conference center in Washington, D.C., Sir Quincy stood before an audience of Fortune 500 executives, civil rights leaders, and government officials. The annual Corporate Accountability Summit had become the premier venue for discussing institutional bias and effective remediation strategies. "The question isn't whether discrimination exists in your organization," Quincy told the assembled leaders. "The question is whether you're willing to acknowledge it and do the hard work necessary to eliminate it." Her presentation included data that was both encouraging and sobering. Discrimination complaints across the airline industry had dropped 40% since Atlantic Premier's transformation began. Customer satisfaction scores for minority passengers had improved dramatically across all carriers, but the data also revealed how pervasive the problem had been and how much work remained to be done. Sienna, now a sophomore at NYU and founder of the Corporate Ethics Institute, addressed the business case for anti-discrimination programs. Atlantic Premier's stock price has increased 60% since implementing comprehensive bias training. She reported employee retention is up 30%. Customer loyalty has improved across all demographics, and the company has avoided over $400 million in potential discrimination lawsuits. The numbers told a story that even the most profit-focused executives couldn't ignore. Treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, it was financially smart. Victor Sinclair had become one of the most respected CEOs in America, but his focus remained on expanding the transformation beyond Atlantic Premier. He was working with other industry leaders to establish mandatory bias training across the transportation sector, using federal contracting requirements to incentivize change. "We can't rely on corporate goodwill alone," he explained during a panel discussion. "Sustainable change requires structural incentives that make discrimination costly and equality profitable." The regulatory landscape had shifted dramatically as well. The Department of Transportation now required quarterly discrimination reporting from all commercial airlines. The Department of Justice had established a corporate bias investigation unit that conducted surprise audits of companies with federal contracts. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had gained new authority to impose financial penalties for systematic discrimination, creating real consequences for companies that failed to address bias in their operations. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The phrase Atlantic Premier moment had entered the business lexicon, describing any situation where hidden institutional bias was suddenly exposed to public scrutiny. Corporate leaders now understood that discrimination wasn't just a legal or ethical issue, it was a reputation risk that could destroy decades of brand building in a matter of hours. The twins had used their platform to address broader issues beyond air travel. They worked with hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and healthcare systems to implement accountability programs. Their book, When Dignity Demands Justice, had become required reading in business schools across the country. But they never forgot where their journey had begun or the people who had helped them along the way. Rosa Kingsley was now Atlantic Premier's Director of Employee Advocacy, leading programs that encouraged staff to report bias without fear of retaliation. Her secret recordings of discriminatory behavior had become a catalyst for creating safe spaces for witnesses to speak up. Calvin Hughes had been promoted to Chief Information Security Officer, not despite his decision to preserve evidence of discrimination, but because of it. His refusal to participate in the cover-up had demonstrated the kind of ethical leadership Atlantic Premier now valued above all else. Even the employees who had initially discriminated against the twins had found new purposes. Kyle Manning's sensitivity training programs had been adopted by 12 other airlines. Madison Pierce's bias detection protocols were being implemented in airports nationwide. Their transformation from perpetrators to advocates proved that people could change when given the opportunity and support to examine their actions honestly. Preston Harrington had quietly retired from corporate life, his attempted cover-up having destroyed his reputation and influence. But his downfall had sent a clear message to other executives. The old ways of protecting discriminatory systems were no longer sustainable. As the twins prepared to graduate, Quincy from Columbia Law, Sienna from NYU Business, they reflected on how much had changed since that October morning in Atlanta. The scared teenagers, who had clutched their boarding passes and wondered if they belonged in first class, had become confident young women who were reshaping corporate America. At their final college presentation, delivered jointly at a packed auditorium that drew students from across New York City, they shared the lessons they'd learned from their experience. "The most important thing we discovered," Quincy told the audience, "is that systems don't change themselves. They change when people refuse to accept injustice as normal, when they document what they experience, and when they have the courage to speak truth to power." Sienna continued the thought. "But individual courage alone isn't enough. Real change requires allies, People like Rosa, who preserve evidence, like Calvin, who refused to participate in cover-ups, like the passengers who recorded what they saw and shared their own stories. The twins had learned that transformation happened through a combination of personal bravery and collective action. Their story had resonated precisely because it demonstrated how ordinary people could challenge extraordinary injustice and win. In the audience sat Zoe Williams, now 9 years old, the little girl who had approached them at LaGuardia Airport a year earlier. She was there with her school's Future Leaders Club, learning about advocacy and social change. For her generation, the idea that someone might be denied service or subjected to harassment because of their race seemed as archaic as denying women the vote or requiring separate water fountains. That was the twins' greatest victory, not the policy changes or corporate transformations, but the creation of a world where children like Zoe could assume they belonged everywhere they went. After the presentation, as students and faculty gathered for conversations about implementing change in their own organizations, Quincy and Sienna stepped outside onto the Columbia campus. The crisp autumn air reminded them of that morning in Atlanta when their journey had begun. "Do you ever think about what Dad said that day?" Sienna asked. "About how transformation comes through fire." "Every day," Quincy replied. "But I also think about what we proved, that when you refuse to accept good enough as good enough, when you demand that institutions live up to their stated values, change is possible." They walked toward the subway, two young women who had learned that the arc of justice doesn't bend toward equality on its own. It bends because people like them grab hold of it and pull. Their phones buzz simultaneously with a news alert. Breaking. Federal Aviation Administration announces mandatory bias training for all commercial aviation employees based on Atlantic Premier model. Sienna smiled. "Looks like our work isn't done yet." "It never is," Quincy agreed. "But that's okay. Every generation has to choose whether to accept the world as it is or fight for the world as it should be." As they descended into the subway, joining the diverse crowd of New Yorkers heading home, they carried with them the knowledge that individual courage, when combined with institutional accountability, could create change that lasted far beyond any single story. The twins had started their journey as passengers denied boarding. They were ending it as leaders who had helped build a more just society. One policy change, one training program, one transformed heart at a time. Their father had been right about transformation coming through fire, but they had learned something even more important. When you refuse to be consumed by that fire, you can use it to forge something stronger and more beautiful than what existed before. The phone call that had grounded an airline had ultimately elevated an entire industry. The discrimination that was meant to diminish them had instead amplified their voices. The system that had tried to silence them had been forced to listen. And in conference rooms and training centers across America, in airports and boardrooms and carrosses, people were still learning the lesson that Quincy and Sienna Beaumont had taught the world. That dignity is not negotiable, justice is not optional, and change is always possible when people have the courage to demand both. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Because in a world where discrimination still existed, there would always be more gates to walk through, more systems to challenge, more victories to win. And somewhere in Atlanta, at Gate 32 of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, passengers of all backgrounds were boarding their flights with the dignity and respect that every human being deserved. The legacy of two teenagers who had refused to accept anything less. Thank you to everyone who typed respect and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.